few miles away from the rim of the Grand Canyon, thousands of feet below the Earth's surface, lies a classic whodunit. And no, it's not a murder mystery. It's a contamination mystery. The victim? Our water. The suspects? Mining, agriculture, and urban development.
We really have a witch's brew of potential contamination out there. You can look at different boreholes, you can look at different geophysics, and you can get a three-dimensional picture of fractures and faults. It is a detective game.
Today on Naked Nuclear, we have the privilege of learning from world-renowned hydrogeologist Dr. David Kreamer. With decades of experience unraveling these intricate mysteries, Dr. Kreamer guides us through the twists and turns of contamination cases.
The problem is even more complicated than just contamination. It's not only a water quality problem, but it's also a water quantity problem as well.
Revealing how pollutants move, how we uncover their origins, and how humans can play an unexpected role in this story. Dr. Kreamer is an internationally recognized expert in hydrology and hydrogeology. He's also an emeritus professor in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he taught and conducted research for over 30 years. His expertise spans in groundwater and hydrology, contamination transport, as well as the intersection between water systems and the public health environment. He's delivered keynote addresses at over 20 global conferences, more than 50 universities, as well as the United Nations General Assembly. He's also testified in front of U.S. Congress and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on water quality issues specifically related to uranium mining. His work has taken him across the globe from Niger to China and also the Grand Canyon. Beyond academia, he has served as the president of the International Association for Hydrogeologists and has held leadership roles in numerous professional organizations. So, if you're anything like me, you might naturally assume that the world-renowned expert in contaminant hydrogeology would be completely against uranium mining. But you know what they say when you assume.
Everyone's for responsible mining. That is mining that protects our environment. The new push for uranium is important for many aspects of our life. Our nuclear infrastructure is really very old. The average age of our nuclear power plants is about 42 years. One reactor at a nuclear power plant was built in 1969. We really need a push for not only uranium to supply our nuclear dreams of the future, but also to ensure that we have the infrastructure. The Biden administration had a declaration where they want to push for much more uranium mining. Last year at the climate summit, the COP28 in Dubai, they actually had a coming out of that for nuclear advancement. And so there's a push worldwide for more nuclear development. My point of view is from the environment, and I do a lot of work with groundwater and springs and protection and sustainability of our natural world. And what I've seen in some cases, a legacy of mining that is not too friendly to water resources and to ecosystems. And so that's been a push for a lot of my work. And what I've seen in the past are examples of legacy of groundwater contamination that can go on for years. One example is in the Grand Canyon, the Lost Orphan uranium mine operated for about 13 years off and on between the late 40s and 1969, 1970. And it was in a formation called a breccia pipe, which is a collapse feature. It was right on the rim of the Grand Canyon, about 2 miles away from Grand Canyon Village on the West Drive. And what we're finding, my research group was the really first one to find that down below, thousands of feet below, the springs had high uranium concentration above EPA standards. And that's persisted even up until last year. We still see very, very high uranium concentrations below the site of this now defunct mine.
Aha! The case is closed. Legacy uranium mining is the culprit in our contaminant whodunit. But could it really be that simple? First, what kind of mining have we used historically, and how is that different from what we do now?
There's several different types of mining going on in the United States. One type is underground mining, which is about a little less than a third of our uranium mining. We have open pit mining that's, 13 or 14% of our mining is there. One of the things that's been done a lot, not only here, but around the world, is in situ leaching. And the way that works is you pump water down with a mobilizing agent. In other words, it's got chemicals in it. They call it a lixiviant. And what it does is it attaches to the uranium and mobilizes it. And then you have extraction wells, which bring that mixture, they call it a pregnant solution. They bring it to the surface with the uranium, and the uranium's extracted on the surface. With these types of mining, there are challenges. If you don't extract efficiently, you're mobilizing a potential contaminant, and you have to have the world's biggest catcher's mitt to make sure that you actually collect things and don't let them escape.
So to recap, we have three different types of mining. Underground mining, less than a third of what we do here in the United States. Open pit mining, between 13 and 14%. And in situ leaching. According to the Department of Energy, in situ leaching is somewhere between 80 and 90% of the uranium extraction that we do here in the US. So then, how did our victim, Groundwater Systems, get involved in this contaminant whodunit?
A lot of people, when they think of groundwater, think about an underground lake or a river. And in some cases, like in cave systems, which are limestone or carbonate systems, there are passages where you can have rivers and even lakes. But that's really a minority of groundwater flow. A lot of groundwater flow is actually between sand grains, and it's actually in the rock itself. So there's distinctions of different types of groundwater flow, some in hard rock systems that goes through faults and fractures, and in other cases it sort of seeps in between grains. And so there are many, many different types of groundwater systems, and they're very complicated. If you take a overly simplified view for the protection of groundwater and our water sources from wells and things of that sort, you can run into problems. For example, if there are faults and cracks and fractures, and even in limestone systems, if you have passageways with water flow and you miss those with your monitoring systems, you can get excursions of contamination from a mine site. And so it's very important to protect the environment, to make sure that you take into consideration the complications. Sometimes mining companies don't do complicated analysis. They rely on a fairly simple model of the subsurface, and it can be much more complicated and much more possible for pollutants to leave a mining site.
Excursions of a contaminant from a mine site. That sounds complicated. But here's another way to think of it. I'll use this example because it actually happened to me. I went through a car wash and didn't check all of my windows before I drove through. After I went through, I realized that my whole back seat had pink, green, and blue soapy water all over the upholstery. Now, I didn't need a complicated geophysical analysis to realize my window was open, but had I taken the time to survey the whole situation, I probably wouldn't have spent 3 hours drying out my back seat. Let's say the interior of my car is a groundwater aquifer. My car's mud-caked exterior, the uranium. And the car wash, that's in situ leaching. In this analogy, a hydrogeologist has to be able to monitor numerous variables, from pre-existing cracks in my windows, the pressure of hose nozzles, the runoff of soapy, dirty water. So, what does this look like in real life?
There are many methods to characterize a site. There are some methods that just rely on monitoring wells. The US EPA has guidance on monitoring wells, and unfortunately, one or two of our mining sites don't have adequate monitoring, in my estimation, as a hydrogeologist. One of them actually is 9 miles from the south rim of the Grand Canyon, which just started operating a year ago. There's a deep aquifer, and there's only one well in that system. And in the deep aquifer system, the deep groundwater system, if you only have one well, you're sort of gambling that it's in the right position. If it's up gradient, of where the groundwater flow is going, all the contamination will go away from the well and not be recorded. So the EPA has guidelines and the number of wells and things like that. And sometimes, for reasons of economy or other reasons, the adequate monitoring is not there. But there are other methods as well. You can do geophysics, where you send some sort of device which measures the subsurface. It can measure fractures and faults. It can measure where water's located. Different types of geophysics occur. There's surface geophysics, which don't disturb the subsurface, but there's also borehole geophysics, where in a drilled hole, you can actually send devices down and see what the situation is down below. So those are some of the things you can do. Aquifer testing is another way to do it. When you have an aquifer, if you pump it at a certain rate, you can watch how the water levels change in wells, and that will tell you the ease of flow and whether groundwater can flow quickly or slowly. And then in some systems, you can even do dye tracer tests, where you put a dye in and you measure its arrival in another place, and that'll give you an idea of the average groundwater velocity in the subsurface. And so these are all sorts of tools. Lastly, I would say a lot of people don't know, but you can date groundwater. I know that sounds like something that lonely hydrologists would do, but just like you can date old bones with carbon 14, there are a whole bunch of different isotopes that are like clocks. And you can tell from the isotopic record, well, stable isotopes, you can sometimes tell where groundwater fell as rainfall, what elevation it fell. You can tell its pathway with some groundwater tracers, and you can tell how long it's been in the ground, its average residence time. A lot of people say dating, as if it's one date, but you got to remember that groundwater can have short and long pathways that mix together. So what you're really looking at is an average groundwater residence time with some of the dating techniques of groundwater. And that'll tell you how vulnerable your springs are, your wetlands are, and things like that, how soon it will be before the potentially could receive contaminated water.
So, in this contaminant whodunit, the hydrogeologist has to work as a detective, using numerous tools such as well monitoring, aquifer testing, subsurface and surface geophysics, as well as groundwater dating. All these tools give better insight and analysis to what's happening underneath the surface. But the mystery of groundwater contamination doesn't always remain below the surface. And when it does come to light, there can be drastic consequences.
It is a detective game. It's sort of intriguing that way. And the results, unfortunately, sometimes the people who bear the brunt of some of the problems are people who maybe live out of the way. In the Navajo reservation, for example, there's over 500 abandoned uranium mines and homes and water sources, wells on the Navajo reservation or the Navajo Nation actually have elevated uranium in many of the wells. And so that legacy is something not only for humans, but for ecosystems and things like that, that we're trying to protect.
Dr. Kreamer is a subject matter expert in this region. He's spoken out on behalf of several Navajo Nation tribes in regards to uranium contamination of water supplies. But as with everything in hydrogeology, it's not a simple contamination problem alone.
Let's just take one example from the Grand Canyon again, a feature called the breccia pipe. And very briefly, geologic history, the roof will collapse and it will keep collapsing. And in the Grand Canyon, it collapses all the way up to the rim, up to the surface. So essentially, you have a chimney of broken rock. And over geologic history, water with a little bit of uranium in it flows up and down. And when it hits a low oxygen zone, uranium has a tendency to become solid. We call it chemical precipitation, and it becomes an ore. So if you keep that in the back of your mind, that in low oxygen conditions in the subsurface, uranium becomes solid, but the opposite is true. In high oxygen conditions, uranium mobilizes. These mines drill down, they're underground mines, and they have exploratory shafts, over 17 and a half miles of exploratory boreholes. So they sort of Swiss cheesed it a lot. And then there's major shafts that go down in ventilation. So they're actually oxygenating the whole system. And so that could redissolve uranium into the subsurface.
So underground, when the uranium can't breathe, when there's no oxygen and it's struggling for air, it becomes solid, hardened like a rock. But when uranium is underground and is exposed to air, with high oxygen, it dissolves back into the liquid, back into the groundwater, where it's more capable of moving and mobilizing. This is also where you can get naturally occurring uranium levels in the water without man-made intervention. However, exploratory boreholes introduce new oxygen and ventilation into these subsurface systems. Not to mention, uranium isn't the only product found down in these mines.
You asked about other pollutants as well, and they're pumping water out of these shafts to keep them dewatered. And not only is there uranium well over standard, but there's arsenic well over standard. A geologist will tell you that's because arsenic is in a type of rock called sulfides, and the sulfides dissolve and the arsenic is released. So there's a lot of other potential pollutants with the mining operations, and different mining operations have different sorts of pollutants associated with it. A little over 40% of the mining in the world is in Kazakhstan, and Canada, Namibia, Australia, Uzbekistan, even Niger, Africa, they do uranium mining. And some of this uranium mining is in situ leaching, and the mobilizing agents sometimes are acids. In my textbooks, I write a little bit about the different contaminants. There's sometimes other sorts of chemicals that you wouldn't want to let escape.
So, what about the mining done here in the United States?
Well, a little bit of background. The uranium mines are mostly in the West right now. Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado. And many of these areas are arid or dry areas where water is at a premium. The problem is even more complicated than just contamination. For example, I'll go back to this breccia pipeline near the Grand Canyon. It used to be called Canyon Uranium Mine, but they changed the name to Pinyon Plains Mine. They pump 8 to 10 million gallons of water out a year. And some of the springs of the Grand Canyon are very small. And so it's not only a water quality problem, but it's also a water quantity problem as well. This is not only for uranium mining. Lithium is becoming more important for our batteries. The one lithium mine in the United States is in Nevada, my home state, and they pump about 3.5 billion gallons of water a year. They want to move up to 6 billion gallons of water a year, as some of the new lithium mine proposals are 10 billion gallons of water a year from the subsurface. We also have threatened species in some of the springs. Groundwater is relied upon a lot in these areas, and springs sometimes are very far apart and become refugia for a lot of critical species, especially the ones that can't travel long distances. Birds can travel from spring to spring, but frogs and things like that, if the next spring is a long way away, they're sort of situated in one place. So if legislation were to address these things, they would have to address not only water quality issues, but water quantity issues as well. Environmentalists, the biggest legislative hammer they've always had is the Endangered Species Act. There's many ways to address these things with regulatory agencies, but some of the Supreme Court rulings recently actually are not environmentally friendly. There's one decision that's in the last year called the Sachs decision. And what they ruled is a definition of waters of the United States. And waters of the United States are protected under the Clean Water Act. But they ruled that springs, wetlands, and ephemeral streams, ephemeral meaning they only flow part of the time, they're not considered waters of the United States, and therefore they don't have the protection. I do think that is really going to be watched with great interest, how we proceed on some of these issues to protect our children and our environment.
So, let's recap. It sounds like the work of a hydrogeologist is very complicated. You got a water quantity problem with the amount of water being pumped out of these mines, a water quality problem, not only monitoring uranium, but other contaminants such as arsenic and other heavy acids in the mobilizing agents. You have to do geophysics to analyze fractures to understand where these leaching products could end up. And on top of that, there is a delicate ecosystem of small and endangered species such as frogs and other amphibians that rely on these small, ephemeral streams and ponds for their lifelines. It sounds like risky business. So, how do scientists even begin to move forward?
There's many methods to look at risk to the environment, but again, some of that is dependent on the data you gather. If you don't gather enough data, if you don't monitor correctly, essentially you're a blind person walking through a complicated room. The value of a risk assessment really is dependent on proper information gathering, proper monitoring, real in-depth knowledge of the groundwater system. For example, in many of these systems in hard rock, where a lot of our uranium mines are, fractures and faults are very important. And there's a way to do complicated fracture analysis where with just boreholes, you can do what's called tomography in the medical industry. They put you in a machine and they can scan your inside. There's an analogy with geology. You can look at different boreholes, you can look at different geophysics, and you can get a three-dimensional picture of fractures and faults and that sort of thing to see if there's preferential pathways in the subsurface that you don't want to miss if you're monitoring and things of that sort. But some of these methods can be expensive, and if they're not done, we're a little bit in the dark with major assumptions that we make, and then our risk projections then become uncertain with large error bars that could have disastrous effects. It's a complicated system, and I think more and more responsible mining companies are realizing that the subsurface where they're mining oversimplification can have bad consequences. So some of the uranium mining in the United States is by international conglomerates. They might have a U.S. subsidiary company, but they're from Canada or some other place. And some uranium that's mined doesn't stay in the United States, it goes to other countries. So there's sort of an international question as well, as far as allowing companies from other countries to come in and establish a subsidiary in the United States.
If legacy mining is the prime suspect in the contamination of groundwater, then how do we do a post-mortem? How do we figure out where we went wrong and how we can prevent it for the future?
Well, I don't like to talk about disasters too much, but certainly if there were a lack of monitoring, you could get contaminated water move away from a system. You could have dewatering dry up a system. After a mine closes, an underground mine, for example, you can have subsidence, in other words, collapse. You can imagine if the holes that are opened up by the mining process itself begin to collapse, the whole ground surface moves down, and that opens up new pathways for groundwater flow, and it opens up more contact between groundwater and any residual ore. No mining is 100% efficient. A worst case scenario would be one with lack of monitoring, a lot of residual left in the subsurface, contact with groundwater. In the in situ mining case, where they actually put mobilizing agents down, if the collection system were not efficient, were wrongly placed. There's examples too of other legacy problems. In the 1970s in New Mexico, in the Grants Mineral Belt, a tailings dam broke. Now, tailings are the waste of the mining operation, and it's sort of a liquid sludge, but the tailings dam broke and contaminated radioactive water flowed 80 miles into Arizona, into the Navajo reservation, up to Church Rock. And so that incident now is still protested year after year. So there's a lot of things that are attendant to mining, like waste piles that have to be considered. One mining technique which takes out a little uranium is called heap leaching. That's where you have a lot of waste rock up on the surface and you put certain chemicals through it, acids and things like that will mobilize the contaminant, but you have to again catch all the liquids running through it. Those are the sorts of things that can contaminate a groundwater system. Then there's other things associated with mining that are more or less more minor. when you consider mining, but they're in the overall scheme of contamination, leaking underground storage tanks, gas stations, above ground storage. We really have a witch's brew of potential contamination out there, agricultural runoff, pesticides, and other things of that sort. And so the whole environmental picture is more complicated. But when it comes to mining, there are some basic things that, if they're not done correctly, can result in long term legacy contamination.
So, according to Dr. Kreamer, it really sounds like when we're not doing sufficient monitoring and analysis of groundwater systems, quality and quantity, making sure that our waste containment, such as our tailing dams, are secured. If we're not doing that, then we increase the potential of a contaminant reaching our water systems. However, through rules and regulations, if we can properly regulate those parts of mining, then we can lower the risk of a contaminant reaching our groundwater.
Some of our state and federal environmental regulators are important, and they have a job of evaluating these things. Unfortunately, some of this is new to some of them. The underground uranium mine in near the Grand Canyon, it's the first aquifer protection permit that the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality ever issued. And they got some wrong information as far as the thickness of an upper aquifer and the potential for connection between an upper aquifer and a lower aquifer. Information that was used, that was old information. The first environmental impact statement that was done in that area was 1987. And a lot of that information is now with new studies by the U.S. Geological Survey and academic researchers really shows a different picture than the old preconceived notions. The EPA, for example, just came out with an external assessment, and they said that the monitoring was inadequate. Those are some of the safeguards we have. Some mining areas are more risky than others because of the geology. I guess the bottom line is that if the public's comments, particularly those of scientists who are involved in the field for years and years, are listened to. I've been studying the springs of the Grand Canyon, for example, well before the mining operations really got going for over 35 years. We know some of the pathways. I'm groundwater dating, and there have been dye tracer tests done in the Grand Canyon that show that water from the surface can get all the way down to the deep aquifer. So there's connections between a shallow aquifer and a deep aquifer, which the mines said did not exist. The real future of doing things correctly is to gather the correct information and have a lot of checks and balances in the system.
Checks and balances in the system. One of the things I notice about some of the younger generations is not only are they full of vim and vigor, but they are ready to take on environmental polluters, providing some of these checks and balances to our system. So I wanted to get Dr. Kreamer's insights on what he thinks of the younger generation, some of his students, and how they can get involved.
My students in the class, I see a lot of students who just want to make the world a better place. That's something that even some of us old guys believe in as well. Hydrogeology sounds kind of weird to a student who's just starting out, but as you say, it can be a cool detective game. You can help the environment. You can help protect our springs and our wetlands. Uh, I started off mucking around landfills and hazardous waste sites. Some of these sites are pretty ugly. And so, about 10, 15 years into my career, I decided I was going to do more spring sustainability in the national parks, rafting down the Grand Canyon, taking water samples. I've had the opportunity to take students to Africa to put in wells in rural communities, just hydrophilanthropy, if you will, just to do good things for different communities. There's estimates that one third of the wells in Africa, the pumps are broken. Young women are walking past a broken well to a distant water source. Unfortunately, a lot of the things worldwide are gender biased. A lot of young girls have to carry the water for families and they don't get a chance for education. So there's a multitude of things that young students can do. It's not a, it's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. Uh, Unfortunately, most of the springs are closer to the rim than the river, which require long hikes with heavy equipment, carrying out water that you filtered and acidified and you can't drink in the middle of the summer when the temperatures are above 100 degrees. You hike before dawn and then hide in the shade. And in the winter, the snow can blow sideways. Your water samples sometimes you have to put in your sleeping bag so they don't freeze. And so you have a bag full of water samples in your sleeping bag with you. There's a lot of challenges to doing work in the national parks, but they're beautiful places to be. And to see those springs and the wetlands be there for years and years is something that I think a lot of young people can associate with. A lot of people like the outdoors. And the other thing about it is it's a multidisciplinary sort of thing. I know of very few pursuits that have so many side things that deal with public health, with policy, with engineering solutions. How do you clean up this stuff? That deal with the geology, with microbes in the subsurface that can eat some pollutants. So there's microbiology. Certainly there's chemistry of the pollutants involved. And then there's mathematics of groundwater flow and computer modeling and things like that. And now with the future, we're dealing with drones and all sorts of new things that new ways of looking at our environmental problems and solutions. And so it's really an exciting field. And I think that that's not as visible as it should be to a lot of young people who are thinking that they'd like to help the world and help the environment.
A jack of all trades and a master of hydrogeology, I decided to ask Dr. Kreamer some of our rapid fire questions. So my first question is, what did you want to be when you grew up, and how did you get here?
Well, like many people, I didn't want to grow up. When I was really young, a sailor, an astronaut. But as I got more near college age, I actually wanted to be a physician. I wanted to be a doctor. I did my undergraduate in microbiology and chemistry, but as I went through my undergraduate, I got more and more involved in hiking and backpacking, rock climbing, kayaking. I wanted to do something more where I was in the natural world. One day I was rock climbing actually, and some guy on a parallel route was climbing next to me, and we started talking, and it turned out he was a hydrologist. They were doing some work at that time in the Grand Canyon. There had just been an outbreak of a microbial disease, a digestive problem that people going through the Grand Canyon. And they said, we need a microbiologist. And I looked into it and I got into hydrology, got my master's and PhD in hydrology. So that was sort of my journey through this. I'll never regret it.
Wow, that's probably the coolest answer I've heard for how somebody got into a field. Any top places that you've brought your students to and their reactions with it?
Well, some of the places I've been are too dangerous for my students. I had a 5-year project in Niger, Africa, which is the frying pan of Africa. It's about 75% in the Sahara and Teneri deserts. 54% of the people have direct access to clean drinking water. We took satellite photography to try and find groundwater for agricultural development. If you put in a bunch of wells for agriculture, but you dry up community wells all around, you haven't really helped the situation at all. So you have to do mathematical modeling of groundwater. 10 days after we left, there was a military junta that overthrew the democratically elected government. And so those are situations where I wouldn't want to bring a student, but the situations where students have gone overseas or gone to conferences in other countries are really eye-opening. The International Association of Hydrogeologists have their meetings in really interesting locations. They just had one in Davos, Switzerland. The year before that, South Africa, Rome, Korea. Or next one's going to be in Melbourne, Australia, and the one after that in Budapest. But you meet all sorts of different scientists, and I found that students really like that. So I always try and allow my students to go to different conferences and see different perspectives. I was just at the Climate Summit. It was my first time in Azerbaijan, in Baku, and some of the architecture is crazy. I've gotten to kayak down rivers or climb mountains. I've been able to climb Kilimanjaro. I think that people need to not just do one thing. The most valuable people are the ones who have an interdisciplinary view. They see the world in a larger sense. And it's tough because a lot of young people have only been in one town or in one locale, and they haven't had the opportunity to travel.
Another question is, if you had to give a TED talk on something completely other than water, hydrogeology, what do you think it would be?
That's a tough question. I might give it on kayaking. I do a fair amount now. I live very close to the Colorado River and Lake Mead. No matter what problems you have in your life, when you're about to go into a huge rapid on a river, you're not thinking about those problems. You're in the moment. Cycling, hiking, mountaineering, marathons, or maybe something of that sort. I've always been interested in glaciology. I've been fortunate. I have given talks to the General Assembly of the United Nations on general topics about water and water preservation, and talking about hydrophilanthropy and how people can do good things. Sometimes do-gooders make the situation worse, so there's good ways to approach hydrophilanthropy. But generally, those are the sorts of areas I would give a TED Talk.
Awesome. And then my last question, any people, scientists, ideas that you'd want to hear around nuclear energy?
Well, I think we've gone through a lot of them in the show here. I think there's a place for everybody. Engineers can clean up water, the reverse osmosis, ion exchange resins, and absorption media. There's ways that we can do reclamation in some of our mining sites to reduce leaching of contaminants. There's ways that we can plant vegetation to do a better job with that. The takeaways that I would have is there's not just one thing that you can do to make the environment better. And there's little ways that even little kids, conserving electricity, recycling, those are the sorts of things that everybody can do to help move us forward in a positive way.
As we look ahead to a future where uranium mining is set to expand sevenfold, as highlighted in the Department of Energy's liftoff report, we face a critical challenge: how to ensure that this growth doesn't kill our groundwater supply. Pun intended. It's a high-stakes balancing act that requires us to double down on safe mining practices, from implementing rigorous monitoring systems to conducting thorough subsurface analysis and enforcing proper regulations. The tools to safeguard our water are within our reach. But it's not just policymakers and industry leaders who can help. Students and young professionals entering the fields of hydrology, geology, and environmental science have a vital role to play as watchdogs, providing checks and balances to protect our most precious natural resource. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Kreamer for joining us today and sharing his wealth of knowledge and experience. His work reminds us that even the most complex contamination mysteries can be solved with the right expertise, dedication, and care for our environment. Thanks again for tuning into this episode of Naked Nuclear. Feel free to check out the Afterpop, where I'll be breaking down some of the science topics within this episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share with others who are curious about the intersection of nuclear energy, science, and the environment. Until next time, stay curious.